There was no money at Kettle Bend. Very nearly everything that happened there in the summer and autumn of 1903 came out of that one fact. Kettle Bend was a shell camp on the Iowa shore of the Mississippi, 4 miles below Sabula, where the river swings wide and slow around a low sand point and lays mussel beds along the bottom. 67 men worked those beds that season, out of a line of shanty boats moored under the willows, and between the going out of the ice and the middle of October there was not $5 in coin among the whole of them. A clammer rose out over a bar with a crowfoot bar laid across his gunwales, a length of gas pipe hung with 200 wire hooks, and lowers it and drifts, and the mussels close on the hooks and are lifted. Then he boils the shells open in an iron vat, picks the meat out by hand, and stacks the shells white and clean beside his boat. The shells are the wage. The button works at Wicker's Crossing took them by the ton for blanks, and a ton of clean washboard and pigtoe was worth real money in Iowa that year. But it was not money any clammer ever held in his hand. Every ton that left Kettle Bend went over one set of platform scales at the head of the shell yard, and those scales belonged to Alva Renshaw. Renshaw was 62 that year and not what you would picture. A short man, thick through the shoulders, clean-shaven, white hair cut close to the skull, steel-rimmed spectacles pushed up onto his forehead. He said a thing once, at full volume, in front of whoever was standing there, and never said it twice, and never quietly. He owned the scales, the shell yard and the store boat, and against a man's October shells he advanced meal, lard, hook wire, and boat lumber. In 9 years he had never let a family on that bend go into the ice with nothing. He was not loved. He was trusted, which on a shell bank in a bad year is worth a great deal more. A clammer's whole year was a line in Renshaw's book, and the book settled once, in October. A man drew what he needed off the store boat and it was written down, and in October his tonnage was weighed against it and the difference came to him in cash, which went back over that counter the same week for winter meal. Between those 2 Octobers, no coin passed at Kettle Bend at all. There were grown men on that bank in August who had not held a quarter since the previous fall. Everything at Kettle Bend had a value and nothing in it had a price. Delia Mabry came down on the packet on the 9th of August and stood on the bank with everything she owned around her feet. She was 33 and had never married. For 11 years she had run her father's eating house on the levee at Sabula, and on a Tuesday night in July, the stovepipe let go into the wall behind it, and by daylight there was nothing on that lot but a stone step and the range with its legs burned off. Nobody was hurt. Her father went to her sister at Clinton. What she had left was 9 pie tins that had been her mother's, a long-handled wire skimmer, a cash-till drawer with a bell in it, and $94. And she had one fact about herself that she told nobody at Kettle Bend, which was how the eating house had ended. A stove has to stand somewhere, and every foot of levee at Sabula and Clinton wanted rent in advance from a woman with a burned-out name. Kettle Bend wanted nothing, because there was nothing at Kettle Bend to want. She went up to the scales and asked Alva Renshaw for leave to set a cook shop on the strip below the yard. He had 11 men round the beam when she asked, and he answered at the volume he answered everything. Cooked food does not sell on a shell bank. A clammer eats meal and lard, and whatever he takes out of the river does it himself for 2 cents, and will not pay a dime for the same thing done better. She was welcome to the strip below the yard, and he would take nothing for it, because nothing was what she would take at it. Then he said the other thing, and this one he said slower. No fire burns on the bank at Kettle Bend. Not hers, not anybody's, not a cook fire, and not a smudge. Any man who wants a fire keeps it out on the wet sand below the line of the water and nowhere else. If she wanted a stove, she would keep the stove on the water. She asked him why. He looked at her over the top of his spectacles and said, "Because that is the rule," and went back to his beam. So she put her stove on a boat. A flat shell scow lay at the head of the bend, 30 feet by 12 with a plank roof over most of it, and she paid a man $22 for it out of the 94 and had it warped down and tied against the bank below the yard. She set a second-hand range on a bed of sand and brick amidships, carried the chimney up through the roof with a wire spark hood she made out of a screen door, laid a plank counter along the side that faced the bank, under a canvas awning, and stood the till drawer at the end of it. Then she had to decide what to sell. And here the thing turns. Delia Mabry did not sell those men what they lacked. She sold them the one thing on that bend a man could not do for himself for 2 cents. A lemon does not grow within 1,100 miles of Kettle Bend. Lemons came up the river in a wooden box under the packet's forward awning, and they cost cash, and there was no other way on earth to get one. Her mother had made a lemon meringue pie the way her people made it in Ohio, and Delia had made it every Saturday for 11 years for the levee trade at Cibola. She grated the peel into the sugar, beat the yolks and the cornstarch in, and stood over the boiler with a wooden spoon until the curd went thick and clear and gold, then poured it steaming into a blind-baked shell. Then she whipped the whites in a tin bowl until they stood up in her hand, heaped them on, and drew them into peaks with the back of a spoon, and put the whole of it in the oven until the peaks browned and the valleys stayed white. When she opened that oven, the smell went off the scow and downwind over the bend, and every man on the bank turned his head. That was the 15th of August, and before noon she did the thing that is the picture of this whole business. She carried one whole pie up the bank in both hands to the head of the shell yard and set it down on the plate of Alva Renshaw's platform scales in the sun, still steaming, and asked him to weigh it and price it by the pound, since weight was the only price anybody at Kettle Bend had ever agreed on. Renshaw came up off the shell heap with his hands still white with shell dust, and he got his spectacles pushed up and his mouth open and did not get one word out of it, and stood there with his own beam swinging under a lemon meringue pie in front of a dozen of his own men. She was not enjoying it. Her hands were shaking on the rim of the tin. He weighed it. He was too exact a man not to. 2 pounds and 9 ounces, he said, and that was all he said. She baked 9 pies that morning, 3 at a time, cut them into 8 each, and set 67 wedges out on a scrubbed plank along the counter, one for every man working the bend. And 67 men came up the bank, and every one of them refused. Not one word was said against her. That is what she had not been ready for. They came in 2s and 3s with their forearms still gray to the elbow from the vats, and looked at that plank a long time. One of them said please and thank you, both, and never put out a hand. A young fellow of 26 took his hands out of his pockets and put them behind his back, and kept them there. Then they went back down to the vats, all 67 of them. And at 4 o'clock, Delia Mabry carried the plank back inside with 67 wedges on it, untouched. She did that once. She never set it out a second time. By the time the last man had gone down the bank, she understood what walking past that plank had cost each one of them, and she was not going to charge them that twice. The next morning she went up and asked out loud at the scales in front of everybody, why would nobody eat? She got her answer from 3 men at once, and it was so simple it took her a moment to hear it. Nobody had a nickel. Not one man on that bend had a nickel. The settle was 9 weeks off. So she said the obvious thing. Take it now and pay me at the settle. Put my name down beside Renshaw's. And that is when Alva Renshaw said his piece at full volume on his own platform with his book shut under his arm, and he was not cruel about it, and he was not wrong. 2 books on one bend, he said. A man able to owe in 2 places will owe in 2 places. And in November he will settle the one that has his winter lumber in it and go into the ice short on the other. And it is not the man who eats that difference. It is his wife and his children. And here is what makes it a hard story instead of a mean one. Every man standing there knew he was right and said so. They were not being bullied. They agreed with him. Underneath that there was a second thing, and nobody had to say it. On a bank where a man's whole winter turns on one man's opinion of him, being seen to take food he could not pay for is not a small matter. It is not that Renshaw would have held it against anybody. It is that a man does not want to be looked at that way in front of 66 others he rows out with every morning of his life. Delia Mabry sat on the counter of that scow for 2 days with her hands in her lap. Then she did the one thing nobody expected, which was to stop selling to the Bend altogether. She hired 2 men for $1 apiece and had the SCO warped end for end at Slackwater so that the counter and the till and the bell no longer faced the bank at all. They faced the river. That is the whole pivot of this story, and it cost $2. Because the river had money on it. The packet came down at 7 in the morning and back up at 4:30 with passengers on her boiler deck and a crew of 14, all of them carrying coin, and raft crews came through Willow Chute paid off in cash at Clinton. And the packet's clerk, once he had eaten 1 wedge of that pie at her counter with the boat's lines still slack, began bringing her lemons up from Clinton as a standing order and taking his commission in pie. Within 2 weeks that scow sold out by 10 in the morning and again by 5 in the afternoon, and Delia Mabry had a problem nobody at Kettlebend had ever had. She needed things, she had cash to pay for them, and she was the only person on that bend who did. She needed driftwood split and stacked by the rick. She needed eggs and butter and milk, and there were farms behind the willows with women who had all 3 and no way on earth to turn them into money. So she paid for it. Every time, in coin, at the end of the day, counted out of the till drawer on the plank with the bell going. Aggie Vance came down the first week with 3 dozen eggs in her apron and went home with 45 cents in her fist, which was the first money she had held in her own hand since the last settle. Her husband, Pearlie Vance, was 58 and had ruined his knees on the bars, and he split and stacked her wood for $1 a day. And on the first Thursday in September, Pearlie Vance came along that plank counter and laid his quarter down on the wood so hard that every man on the bank heard it hit, and asked for 1 wedge of lemon meringue pie, and asked her to count the change out loud. He had earned that quarter that morning with an axe in his own 2 hands, and he wanted the coin heard. 2 more men came before dark. 9 came the next day. Inside a week there was a line of Clammers along that plank at noon with money in their fists, and the bell on the till went so often that men out on the bars knew the hour by it. By then there was more loose silver on Kettle Bend than there had been since the bend was settled. One thing Delia Mabry was rigid about. She never took a shell, not in trade and not as a gift, and she never wrote a man's name in any book of any kind. She had listened to Alva Renshaw on the subject of 2 books on one bend and decided he was right. It went well for 3 weeks, and then it went wrong, because of the one fact she had never told anybody. Ezra Folk hauled shells up the plank road for the button works and had a brother on the levee at Sabula, And on the 11th of September, he stood at the head of the yard and said, to Alva Renshaw, in fact, that the woman on the cook scow was the Mabry woman whose eating house burned out from under her in July. Renshaw came down the bank that evening at the busiest hour of her day, with 9 men standing at her counter, and told her to draw her fire. A scow tied against the bank is on the bank for the purpose of a spark, and she could have until the end of the week. She asked him why. She asked twice. And Alva Renshaw, who had never in his life said one thing quietly or twice, would not tell her, and that was worse than the order. Pearlie Vance told her that night, sitting on her woodpile with the day's quarter still in his hand. In the summer of 1898, there had been a cook shanty on the bank at Kettle Bend, built and run by a man named Ovid Bassett, a good enough fellow with a bad chimney. It got away from him at 2 a.m. with the wind straight up the chute and ran the shanty boat line end to end. 11 boats went. 2 families lost their whole outfit and went back up the river with what they stood in. Alva Renshaw stood in the river to his waist for 3 hours passing buckets, and both his palms were blistered white when it was over, and Renshaw had been the man who told Ovid Bassett he could build there. Delia Mabry did not argue, and she did not go. What she did instead took her 1 night and $11. She paid 4 men cash to come out after supper on the 12th of September, and they warped the cook scow off the bank on a kedge and took her 50 yards out into Willow Chute and moored her fore and aft to the piles left from the old ferry in 8 feet of running water, with not a stick of anybody's property within 100 feet. Every spark that left that hood from then on went straight into the Mississippi. She rigged a skiff on a hauling line so a man could pull himself out and back with both hands. On a wet rope. There was now no fire on the bank at Kettle Bend, and there never had been one on the bank, because hers had never touched it. And a shell buyer's authority stops at the water's edge. Alva Renshaw could put anybody off that bank inside 5 minutes. He could not put one person off the river, because the river is nobody's. For 3 weeks he did not come. The line of men pulling themselves out on the hauling rope got longer every noon, and he weighed shells on the bank with his back to it. Then, in the first week of October, Alva Renshaw got into a skiff. That by itself stopped work on the bend, because in 9 years Renshaw had never gone out to anybody. People came to him. At the beam. Pearlie Vance rowed him, and Hobart Sills, his scale tender, sat in the bow, and Renshaw sat in the stern with his hat in his lap until they came alongside her counter. And then he said it at full volume, with 2 men sitting 3 feet from him and the whole bend standing on the bank 50 yards off in the quiet. Because to say a thing like that quietly would have been a second kind of lie. He said the 98 fire, and he said Ovid Bassett's name. He said he had told that man he could build on the bank, and 11 boats and 2 families had paid for it, and that he had made a rule the week after and kept it 5 years and never once said out loud that the rule was his own conscience and not the camp's safety. He said he had put a woman off the bank for a fire she had not lit, and given her no reason while she stood in front of her own customers, and that of the 2, the second was the worse, because the first was fear, and the second was a choice. She let him get to the end of it. Then she asked him one question, which was whether he had ever eaten any of the pie he weighed in August. He had not. He asked her then. He did not tell her, and everybody on both banks heard the difference. He asked her to bring the scow in and land at the foot of the shell yard on settle day, so the whole bend could get at her at once. She said she would, on one condition. She wanted the plate of his platform scales, because on that bend nothing had ever been worth anything until it had been on those scales. The settle fell on the third Saturday of October, and it is the one day in the year when every man on a shell bank has coin in his fist. Renshaw weighed the last tonnage from daylight and paid out of a Japan box on the platform. And by 2 in the afternoon, there was more cash on that shell yard than the Bend saw in the rest of the year together. Delia Mowbray had baked through 2 nights. 23 lemon meringue pies out of 9 dozen eggs, 12 pounds of loaf sugar, and a whole box of lemons brought up by the packet clerk. She paid cash for every lemon of it out of the till drawer. In August, she had a plank of pie and no price anybody could meet. In October, she had a price and a bank full of people who could meet it, and she had built that herself out of a packet boat's timetable, a rick of split driftwood, and 45 cents put into Aggie Vance's hand. Alva Renshaw cleared his own scale plate with his own 2 hands. He lifted off the shell pan and the counterweights and wiped the plate over twice with a wet cloth, and Delia Mowbray laid a scrubbed pine plank across it, set the wedges out along it, and stood the till drawer at the end with the bell facing the yard. Then Renshaw stepped back to the rail of his scale house, put both hands on it, and did not touch anything else for the rest of the afternoon. They lined up, every one of them. 67 men in a line down a shell yard on a bright cold October afternoon in their settle clothes with silver in their hands, and nobody walked anywhere to get there. The farthest any man came was up the bank from his own boat, and the whole of it happened inside 60 feet. And this is the part the men who were there talked about afterwards. To reach that plank, a man had to step up onto the scale platform. The platform took his weight, and the beam swung up and knocked once against its stop, the same knock that had rung over that yard for every ton of shell that ever left Kettle Bend. Then he laid his coin on the plank, and Delia Mowbray put a wedge of lemon meringue pie into his hand, and he stepped down, and the beam fell back. Knock, coin, knock, 67 times. And Alva Renshaw stood at the rail of his own scale house and counted them out loud as they came, the way he had counted every ton off that bend for 9 years. At 67, he stopped. He had his book under his arm the whole time. He never opened it, and he never wrote the number anywhere, and that is the only count Alva Renshaw ever took at Kettle Bend that was not owed to anybody. There was 1 wedge left on the plank. Delia Mowbray pushed the plank a half-inch toward him with 2 fingers and said nothing at all. He came off the rail and stepped up onto his own platform, and the beam went up and knocked against its stop under the weight of the man who owned it, and the whole shell yard made a noise you could hear on the Illinois shore. He did not eat it standing there. He picked the plate up and went back to the rail with it, and what Alva Renshaw looked at for the rest of that afternoon was this: 67 clammers sitting all over his shell yard in the low October sun, on the shell heaps and the plank road and the edge of his own platform, with pie in their hands and their wives and children coming up the bank behind them. Pearlie Vance and Aggie Vance side by side on an upturned tub, and the bell on that till drawer going every few seconds down at the end of his own scales. He stood there and watched the whole of it, and did not say one word, which for Alva Renshaw was the largest thing he had ever done. The scow stayed on her mooring in Willow Chute through the ice and every season after, and in the spring the Bend drove 2 more piles and built a stage out to her. Renshaw's rule about fire on the bank was never lifted, and never needed lifting. And for years after, the men working the bars out in the chute told the noon hour by a till bell coming to them across the water.